Hi everyone, how are you doing today? It is fall in the northern hemisphere. The pumpkins are back. There is pumpkin bread in the oven, and I'm going to be talking about Ice by Anna Kavan. This is not the best fall read, I will have you know, but it was a book that I finished late last night, and when I woke up in the morning, I wanted to talk about it, but I had to work and, all the things. So, and it's taken me a while to kind of process it and figure out how I feel about it because it's a difficult book. It's short, but difficult. So I have the book, I have some notes. Other than that, I don't really have any cool visuals here, so feel free to go do some baking of your own, chores, whatever you like to do. So who was Anna Kavan, first of all? Anna Kavan was born Helen Woods in 1901. She came from a very privileged background. Her family was wealthy, but sadly, she grew up in an unhappy and emotionally neglected childhood. From what I understand, she just went from boarding school to boarding school. And when she came of age, her mother, by all accounts, coerced her into marrying this guy that she didn't really care for. And not only did she marry someone she didn't love, but that guy had a job in Burma, which is now Myanmar. So she left England to go live there for a couple years with him, and it was just a horrific time. Really, really unhappy marriage. It was around this time that she started her writing. Ended up writing several novels under her first married name, so Helen Ferguson. And she also, when World War II broke out, she ended up traveling quite a bit around the world in various places, California, New Zealand. And she also worked for a time in a psychiatric unit for the military, and her job was to interview veterans. And you can just imagine what a difficult job that must have been. So, very sad backstory for Anna Kavan. Kavan was actually a name of one of her characters, and she ended up adopting it as her legal name later in life. She suffered from mental illness and became addicted to heroin, very sadly. Tried to take her life several times, but actually died of natural causes in 1968. So that's kind of an overview of Anna Kavan and her life. And it's important because it has a lot to do with this book and with a lot of her writing. This is the first book I've read by her, by the way. Now, I think anyone watching a review of this wants to know, should I read this book? And I'm just going to start off with a few things you should know about the book, which might just decide it for you right here. So, first of all, this book covers some very dark subject matter. If we're talking about content warnings, there's emotional abuse, there's sexual assault, there's war violence, and just very dark imagery. I don't think it's particularly graphic, and we'll get into that later in the review, but it's very, very bleak and very disturbing, very disturbing. So just be aware of that. It is a dystopian novel, so some of that comes with the territory. It's also an environmental novel and a thriller. It actually spans a bunch of different genres, which is one of the things that makes it pretty interesting, I would say. But there's this general feeling of oppressiveness in the book throughout everything that happens and the characters. And it's not going to be for everybody, and I'm not even sure it was for me, but it is very short. I think the Penguin edition's like 190 pages, so I almost set it down a few times, or at least once, but when I got into the second half of the book, I was able to keep going and just kind of speed through it, so just an FYI. The other thing you should know is that this book gets compared to Kafka quite a bit. And as a huge Kafka fan, I don't think it's anything like Kafka. Kafka wrote about bureaucracy. He wrote about his troubled relationship with his father. He wrote about isolation and loneliness. And while this book gets into some of that isolation and loneliness, I feel like it's far more focused on the abuse that this girl suffers, this main character who isn't even named. And the book is told, even though there's things about it that are unconventional, you don't get quite the same feel from it as a Kafka novel. And Kafka, though he can be quite bleak in his own way, I think still manages to maintain some levity and humor. And this really doesn't have any levity or humor in it at all. So, all right, that's kind of enough of the disclaimers. Let's get into what is the book about. So, Ice is about the narrator's obsession with this glass girl, so-called. Again, she doesn't have a name, but I will read a description of her that I saved from earlier. And this is from towards the end of the book, but I thought it was a really good description. And it kind of comes up throughout the book. Let's see. Her picture was always with me, in my wallet and in my head. Now her image appeared in the open wherever I looked. Her white-lost face was everywhere with its 2 large eyes. Her albino paleness flared like a torch beneath the malignant clouds, drew my eyes like a magnet. She was a shimmer among the ruins, her hair a glittering in the dark day. Her wide eyes of a wronged and terrified child accused me from the black holes of smashed windows. And it goes on, but that's kind of who the girl is. She's almost entirely described by the way she looks, not so much, very little on how she speaks or even what she does. There's a few things that Kavan keeps harkening back to throughout the novel, but she kind of starts with in the beginning of the book, which is this girl has been victimized from childhood. In the early part of the book, it says she had a sadistic mother, and the narrator, his relationship with her is extremely complicated, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but the book is about how he's constantly pursuing her and she's always out of reach. So that's one part of the book. The other part of it is he has this great longing to research these singing lemurs, called the Indris, and they live in this faraway island. So part of him wants to go seek those out and learn about them and research them, but his overwhelming drive in life is to follow this girl and to basically possess her. And then there is another character in the book, the warden, who is basically evil personified. He is just a horrific character and seems to manifest in different ways in the book, which, again, some of this I will get into in the spoiler section of the review, but I'm not going to get into right now. So I read you a section of it just now, and I've got to say that the writing is quite beautiful overall. And let's see, did I want to talk about that quite yet? Yes, let's go ahead and talk about the beauty of the writing. So that was one passage. I'm going to read another one. I really liked how she described, or the narrator described, these different towns that he goes to. And that's another recurring theme in the book, as he keeps going to these really run-down towns. Let's see here. The town appeared to consist of ruins collapsing on one another in shapeless disorder, a town of sandcastles, wrecked by the tide. A great wall which had protected it was broken in many places, both ends subsiding uselessly into the water. The place had once been important. Its fortifications had lain in ruins for centuries. It was still of some historical interest. So the other thing I would say is that the book begins with a lot of his poetic languages about the places he's seeing. But by the time you get to the end of the book, things have reached such a point that the descriptions become even more bleak and less poetic. So that was the town at the beginning of the book. And then if we jump to page, it says 128 here in my notes. So here's another place that he's describing. The whole country seemed stone dead, gray in color, no hills except hills of stones, even its natural contours destroyed by war. And then before that. I longed for something to focus my eyes on. There was nothing inside or out, no fields, houses, or roads, only vast quantities of stones, rubbish, the bones of dead animals, stones of all shapes and sizes, were spread thick all over the ground to a depth of 2 or 3 feet, often piled up in enormous mounds, which took the place of hills in a normal landscape. So that kind of shows us progression, even though almost all the landscape in this book is very desolate and bleak. There's even this change in how it's being described from the beginning of the book to the end, and some of that has to do with the events that unfold too, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, I was really struck by the writing in this book, not because I thought it was Kafkaesque, I really didn't think it was, but there's other features about it that make it quite interesting from a literary standpoint. So the novel is very iterative. It's cyclical, I would say. This finding the girl and losing her again is kind of this common pattern. It's like a recurring dream, and like a recurring dream, it comes back in different ways. It's not quite the same dream every single time, but there's features that are almost always the same. The other thing that's quite interesting about this book and extremely unsettling is that the narrator is first person, but he's weirdly omniscient. Like, he's present in places and scenes that he absolutely could not be, and it's quite it kind of adds to this horrible sense of unease in the book when he just suddenly jumps to a place that's so private and so, far apart from anything he's supposedly allowed to see. So that's pretty creepy. And then sequences of events here don't necessarily make sense, and reality is fluid. That's both events and characters. Things change throughout the novel. You can't be certain that one thing that happens is going to be the case later on in the book, which I thought was quite interesting. I haven't read anything like that before exactly. Maybe one book that comes a little close is Palace of the Peacock by Wilson Harris, which I read a couple years ago, but I think it's a little more noticeable in this book just because so much of the book is written in a very conventional manner, but things like that just kind of jolt you out of that. And I actually like how you're almost tricked into thinking, oh, this is just another book from the early 1900s and there's nothing weird about it, and then suddenly something really weird happens. The novel has a number of different themes that are pretty obvious. I don't think anything here is that subtle. So there's influences of World War II. The warden and his men are very Nazi-like, fascistic undertones for sure. Not very subtle at that, just in the way they're presented and their actions. But there's also the influence of the Cold War, which is when this book was actually written and published. So you've got these little nations that are going through a lot of turmoil, but then there's these bigger players that are kind of taking over, bigger nations, that is. There's nuclear warfare going on. And then there's this whole ice thing. What is it about the ice? So in the book, as it progresses especially, there's this wall of ice that's coming towards them and going to take over the world, basically. And so don't want to really get into this deeply because I realize it could be controversial, but from what I was reading online, there was a lot of speculation in the 40s and 50s about global cooling, and there even came about this idea of this nuclear winter, so-called, that if people use nuclear weapons, somehow it would, or possibly could cause an ice age or something. And this was in part popularized by Carl Sagan in a 1983 article he wrote for Parade magazine. So that's like a whole nother little rabbit trail you can follow if you're interested. I'm not that interested, but it is kind of interesting to see where maybe she got some of these ideas. So in Ice, the novel, we see this kind of these kinds of ideas in a highly fictionalized form. And it's not even clear to me that the ice in this book is caused by nuclear warfare, but the two things are concurrent, and, depending on your interpretation, it may or may not be caused by the wars that are going on in this book. All right, so that was a lot about just kind of high level things here and things that might interest you in reading the book if you can kind of get past the content stuff. I'm going to go into spoiler territory now, so fair warning. There will be chapters on this video, so if you want to stop watching, that's fine. If you want to skip forward, also fine. So let's get into spoiler territory. I told you that this book was very disturbing, and I think that's just kind of putting it mildly. The scenes of violence and assault in this book are very, very uncomfortable. Before I get into that, though, one thing that was kind of interesting about the book was how the characters, as I said, are kind of fluid, and as the book goes on, she keeps teasing you with this idea that the narrator and the warden are the same person. Now, they're never explicitly shown to be the same person, but there's this kind of mirroring going on. I was reminded a little bit of Kurtz and Marlowe in Heart of Darkness, where the one character sees themselves in the other character. In this book, it's a little more overt because sometimes when they're in the same room, the narrator can't tell who he is, who he himself is. So, are they the same character? Is this like an exploration of a person that has two sides to them? Or are they different characters and one is just coming under the influence of the other? I guess that's the question. Either way, both characters, even as individual characters, they're both emotionally and physically abusive. They're monsters. They're horrible. There's just no two ways about it there. Yeah, I was heartbroken by the scenes of abuse in this book. And I had just read Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and that book also kind of deals with similar topics, not in such an explicit way, but I was struck by how Anna Kavan writes these scenes of sexual assault, and also contrasting it with how Jose Saramago wrote them in Blindness, which was extremely offensive and horrible. The way she writes them doesn't diminish their twistedness and the horrific nature of these acts, but I think she succeeds in maintaining the female character's dignity in them and really making you feel this, feel that thing that she's going through as far as a reader might, right? And just really builds empathy for that character without insulting their dignity or completely objectifying them. It's really a difficult line to walk, but I think that she writes that really well, and I don't know if it's because she's a particularly gifted writer in these kinds of difficult areas, or maybe because she brings that female perspective. She just has that ability to be more sensitive about it. I don't know. I'm not sure what it is, but I was just interested by how I felt like I could tell it was written by a woman, I guess. I'm not saying that all men write scenes like that in a bad way or anything. It's just that I've read enough books where men don't write scenes of even just intimacy in a way that's respectful. So, because we're stuck in the narrator's head, the book is extremely uncomfortable. He goes from being this rescuer to a perpetrator and even a murderer. And I guess it begs the question, is this showing the descent of the narrator into evil, or is this just a revealing of who he really is? And I guess that's up to your interpretation. There's times when, in spite of everything he's done, you feel a weird connection to the narrator, or you're able to relate to him on certain levels. There's a scene I really was struck by where, so the narrator gets this chance to escape the ice world, if you will, and the way it's set up is kind of weird and wacky. Probably aliens, I don't know. But the part that actually kind of resonated with me was he's reflecting on his ability to escape, but also that he's part of the world that he lives in and he can't just leave. He can't just leave it behind. Irrevocably involved with events and persons upon this planet. It was heartbreaking to reject what a part of me wanted most, that is, to escape. But I knew that my place was here in our world under sentence of death and that I would have to stay and see it through to the end. So, kind of an interesting bond this narrator feels with the world he's born into, as even though it's really bad, right? Again, major spoilers here, but it's curious to me that in the end, so basically the way the book ends is this girl finally expresses this sort of sense of longing for the narrator or missing him, which is questionable, but anyways, this stirs feelings of regret in the narrator. I think there's no reason to suspect he really changes, but there's just this moment of softness with the narrator, and they leave together, but there's also a sense in which none of this even matters because the ice is about to descend on them and everything's meaningless because of that, which is pretty bleak in itself. Very, very bleak, but I think the ending does have enough emotional resonance to it. It's just that, I don't know, that it just, the ice becomes like the final say here, I guess. I felt like throughout the book, the author just really had a lot she wanted to say about her own experience. She never wanted to leave anything too ambiguous. The fact that the girl was victimized from childhood is something she continues to emphasize throughout the book. And, you know, there's things she just doesn't want to leave ambiguous here. I think that you can view this two ways. It's either like a very raw kind of story, just very, very raw, or it might be a little unedited. Maybe she could have benefited from an editor kind of going through and saying, well, maybe you could hold back a little here or leave this to interpretation. I don't know. I kind of went back and forth. Sometimes I thought the book was way too on the nose, way too over the top. And other times I was just really struck by, you know, the fluid nature of the book and the raw emotion that it conveyed and how she just kind of, she doesn't bother herself with too much world building or anything. Her ideas just flow and she doesn't worry too much about there being, you know, things that some might say need refinement. So, you know, make of that what you will. I think I kind of went back and forth, like I said. I just couldn't make up my mind if it was genius or if it was not very skilled. So I guess my last question here, and this is for people who've read the book, is why do you suppose the narrator, why is this narrated in first person by one of the antagonists in the book? What does that mean? What does it mean that we're put into those awful shoes? Like, why? Especially since the book is about abuse and, you know, what this girl has gone through, what Anna Kavan went through in her, you know, almost forced marriage, you would say. So, I don't know. I still don't know why. And yet, in spite of that perspective, I think that my heart really was touched by the girl's plight, and I didn't like being stuck in the narrator's perspective at all. It was awful, but maybe she's trying to put a message out there too, you know, and this fact that the narrator poses himself as some kind of rescuer, he's helping her, blah, 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 but he's really part of the problem. He is the problem. Yeah, maybe that's why she made him the narrator, to really make people reflect, maybe, on their own actions. I don't know. I wouldn't recommend this book to everyone by any means. It's very, very bleak and twisted, as I've already explained. But it's one of those books I won't forget, that's for sure. And it just made me very, very sad for the author. And I do think it is one of those books where knowing something about the author lends greater depth to it, makes you understand why the book is the way it is, and deepens your understanding of what the author's trying to say. Would it stand as well on its own without any of that context? I don't know, but I felt compelled to learn more about the author from starting the book and being confronted with all this horror, this sadness, this misery. So there you go. I'm going to wrap it up here. I think my pumpkin bread is just about done, and I will see you next time. Bye.